Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Knowledge Exchange seminar. I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Fabrice Fitch, of course, no relation. And I'll come to the introduction in a moment. Can I please just take a minute to remind everybody that closed captioning is available by clicking the CC button on your screen. And I'm going to introduce Fabrice Fitch now, who is a composer and a musicologist who's worked at a number of higher education institutions in the UK, but was trained in France and Canada. And this talk is in particular about the fragmentary Missa Scaramella by Jacob Obrecht, who died in about 1505. It survives uniquely in two of original set of 4-part books. Reconstructing the material of the two missing part books, which is the top voice and the tenor, poses very different problems. So in this presentation, Fabrice will explore these challenges and presents some proposed solutions, which is part of a reconstruction of the entire mass cycle. And one of the outcomes of the work is the rediscovery of the original notation for 2 enigmatic canons in the Credo, which it has been possible to identify and reconstruct. So I'm going to hand over to Fabrice in a second. If you've got questions, please could you put them in the Q&A section, and we will come to those in the last 10 minutes or so, about 2:45, 10 to 7. We'll look at any questions that there are and Fabrice will try to answer them. Okay, over to you, Fabrice. Thank you.
Thank you for that detailed and generous introduction. Right, so I'm going to share a screen. We may have to toggle between different screens for the purposes of musical examples. I'm not sure whether we'll be able to have musical examples at the same time as we hear them, see them as the same time as we hear them, but we're going to do our best. So I start by screen sharing here. That's it, yes. Let's hope that this works. Should do. Right, I'm going to enlarge this screen now. There we go. Okay. So thank you, all of you attending. And I'm speaking about a reconstruction of a fragmentary mass, which I've recently completed. And so what do we mean, first of all, when we talk about reconstructing fragmentary polyphonies? Well, we're dealing with historical documents which are physical and therefore can undergo damage. Sources get damaged in one of 2 ways. The sources for polyphony typically come across in 2 forms. One is where you have a choir book where the leaves can be missing. And I'm going to try and show you, this is an example of a choir book here. And you can see that all the parts are written on the same couple of pages that open out, but you can see that the parts are not written in score form, they're written individually. And here the beginning of each part is signaled by an illumination. So you can see that very clearly. Now, if the outer pages, for example, or if any part of this part book gets damaged, or if somebody comes along and decides they like the look of the illuminations, they can cut them out, and then whatever's on the other side, we lose. So that's one way that a choir book can get damaged, is if we're missing entire pages. Another way that we can miss material is if the polyphony is presented in part book format. So I think I've managed to show, oh no, I haven't got any part books here. Okay, I thought I had. Apologies. So part books are where an individual book contains all the music for a given part. So it might be the top part or the bass or however it might be for a number of pages, for a number of works rather. And so if we come to lose out of a set of 4-part books. If we lose one of the part books, then we've lost one of the parts. So we have an entire voice that's missing for the duration of the mass or of the work in question or set of works, but we have everything else, all the other voices. So this is what's happened in the case of the fragmentary mass that I'm dealing with here. So why reconstruct fragmentary polyphonies? Well, very quickly, so that they could be performed, so that they can be studied. They add to our knowledge of a period of music history. And we can also, by reconstructing polyphony, we also learn about polyphony, because there's nothing quite like having to supply missing voices or missing music to take you back or challenge you to go right to the essence of how that polyphony works. So it's got a pedagogical dimension, in other words. So this was a picture of a choir book. As I say, the part books I haven't got, but well, you can see a bit of it in a bit of some in the moment. So a few opening questions for reconstructing fragmentary polyphonies. If a work is anonymous, which happens quite often in the music before 1600, certainly, then we will go by the knowledge of genre, that's to say the form and the structure and the destination of the work. All of these generate or imply certain decisions about structure and form of the work, which we'll be able to bring to bear on our understanding of the work to try and understand what's missing. We're also going to draw on our knowledge of the musical style of the period. I'm just going to try and, here we go. I've moved this band here, that's better. So we can also draw on our knowledge of the musical style. Now, if the work, on the other hand, is by a missing composer, then we can draw on our knowledge of the personal style of the composer and his habits. And that's very important because in the case of the work in question, we are dealing with a named composer, and moreover, a composer from whom we have actually quite a lot of mass music. Okay, so the composer is Jacob Obrecht. He's a leading composer of the generation of composers born around 1450. Thanks to this rather remarkable portrait that survives, it's the only portrait which is an actual likeness of a composer. Let's say it's the earliest likeness of a composer that we have. And it comes from, it was made in Antwerp, painted in Antwerp. And thanks to the information on the frame of the painting, we actually know the sitter's age and the year it was painted. So we actually have a birth date for Obrecht, which is not approximate, but actually quite exact. He had an active international career, traveled everywhere in Europe, variously to France, Italy, all sorts of places, and served a number of dukes and kings and princes. For our standpoint, he is a composer from whom we have about 30 polyphonic masses, which is, I think, one of the biggest number of masses by a named composer that we have really for any period, well, for the period before 1500 or so. So that gives us a lot of data on which to base the information or base the reconstructed work that we have. From the standpoint of going back to the question why we would want to reconstruct a fragmentary work by him, well, the fact that he's one of the most prominent composers of the period is, I would say, justification enough. So now to consider, I'm just trying to move this so that, there we go. So now the Missa Scaramella is preserved today in just one set of originally 4 part books currently in Krakow. Now the set of part books, there were 4 of them initially, and you can see here on your screen, you have a bit of a picture. You can see at the beginning of the Kyrie, which is the third line down. So it's the beginning of the Mass. And you can see just to the left of that, that you have the name Obrecht written on the staff. So, and also just beneath it, you can see the tail end of the word Scaramella. So that is actually really useful information, because it is telling us that the title of the Mass is Missa Scaramella. Why that's important, we'll get to in a moment. In any case, the point about this set of part books is that we are missing, we have two of them. We have the altus part book and the bassus part book, but we are missing the top voice, the discantus so-called, and we're also missing the tenor part book. This is another slide showing you a little bit of the altus part book here. This is from the source. So again, to recap, we have 4 part books initially, so it's a 4-voice Mass, but 2 of those voices are now missing. These are my 2 principal collaborators on this project. The one on the right, they're both studying an important primary source, as you can see, which is a menu. But the 2 participants are Philip Weller, who sadly died in 2018. And since his death, I've been very much helped by Paul Kolb, who's an American colleague who's currently working at the Flemish University, Catholic University in Leuven. And also I've been working with Andrew Kirkman, the director of the Banchois Consort, and together we hope to make a recording of this Mass in due course. So 2 lost part books, 2 different challenges. In the discantus, the top line, in a sense, well, what you're inventing is free. Obviously, when we say that we're inventing freely, we mean that it is obviously within stylistic constraints. And because it's the top line, it's the line that sits above everything else. So in the theory, it's got actually quite a few possible solutions to any given problem, contrapuntal problem we may have. This is particularly true given that the discantus is a voice that can cross quite low, below the range or within the range of the altus and even the tenor occasionally. So the discantus is in a sense the one that has the most possibility attached to it from a melodic perspective. The tenor is a different problem. The tenor sits in the middle of the texture. But the tenor in this period doesn't denote a voice range as it does in the modern period, but instead it denotes a vocal function. And that function usually is that it carries the borrowed material. I'll get back to the borrowed material, sometimes also known as the cantus firmus. Most music, not all, but a good deal of certainly sacred music, most sacred music in this period is built on some borrowed material. Very often this is plain song, but from about 1450 onwards, composers started using popular songs or courtly songs and material from courtly songs or popular songs as the basis of, as the borrowed material for new work. Typically, the material from the new work from the old work, from the borrowed work, is placed in the tenor voice. The tenor is the voice that controls the counterpoint and that determines the counterpoint. So the first thing a composer does in composing a Mass is to choose a tenor and lay it out and decide how he's going to deploy it. So the first task in reconstructing a Mass by Obrecht is going to be to determine the presence or the absence of a cantus firmus. Since, as it says on the bullet point here, all of Obrecht's masses, the extant ones, the ones that survive, are based on borrowed material of some kind or other. So again, the first thing that we have to do in reconstruction, and this is different from what happens later in the Renaissance, but because we're dealing with a cantus firmus Mass, the first thing we need to do is to find the cantus firmus. Now, in the case of this Mass, because we know that it is a Mass called Missa Scaramella, we know that the borrowed tune is the Scaramella tune. Scaramella is a tune that is well known. It's perhaps best known from a setting of it by Josquin des Prés. And you can see it here on this slide. I've written it out in original notation. but you can see this is really the form that Obrecht is going to use for this tune most of the way through the work. One of Obrecht's habits as a composer is that he will very often stick to the version of the tune that he's using. He varies it sometimes, but only in very specific circumstances. He generally prefers to leave the tune as it is all the way through the Mass. And that's really useful from the point of view of the reconstruction process, because it means that wherever we can see that we can slot the tune, then it's going to be a lot easier to fit it. In the interest of time, I wonder whether we can try and play a bit of the tune, maybe the Josquin setting. Okay, so now the problem with reconstructing the tenor in the case of Obrecht, I mentioned that when he uses a borrowed tune, he usually likes to stick to a specific way of notating it. And so there is an element of consistency. The problem is that Obrecht's cantus firmus treatment otherwise is not always so straightforward. So for example, he could transpose it, he could use the retrograde, he could use the inversion. In one case, he even has the retrograde inversion. Sometimes he could use a combination of any of these together in combination with the prime. You could read the tune from the middle forward and then back and then vice versa. He can ask you to do that, or rather he can use the tenor in this way, or he could even reorder the pitches of the tune. So the problem that Philip Weller and I had when we started the project is that we realized that there was a possibility, as if Obrecht were using the tune in any one of these very difficult ways, it would potentially be very difficult to discover which way he was using if it wasn't immediately obvious. And so there was always a danger for us that part of the tenor the tenor voice, might be impossible to reconstruct. And that was always the risk that we were running. In the end, we were fortunate, I think, in that it's been possible to recover the tenor in its entirety, with just one section where there's a little doubt whether our solution is the right one. But in general, we've been successful in recovering all the tenor statements and all the statements of the tune where it happens in the Mass. So yes, and you could also segment the tunes and reorder them as well. All of these things are things that Obrecht is known to do. So here is a straightforward example. This is the score from the new Obrecht edition as it was published some 30 years ago. And you can see that they helpfully left the two staves corresponding to the top part and the tenor completely blank. And if that isn't an invitation to somebody, especially, I guess, a composer, to step in there and start scribbling, well, I don't know what is. Meanwhile, what you can see here is that the tune fits perfectly well, fits exactly in the tenor voice. And at the point where it stops, is also the point where the section ends. So that's the entire Kyrie 1 is dealt with, and you can fit in the tenor exactly at this point. Here we go. Right. Now, but we're not always going to be so lucky. Sometimes you have to do a bit more detective work. This is a page from the end of the Gloria. And what you can see is that if you look where my cursor is, bar, I guess it's bar 100, no, 160, sorry. You can see that in the alto voice, we have the tune ba 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 bum bum ba ba bum ba ba bum bum. Right. And we have the tune there with a few little modifications. And that in itself is what I call a kind of smoking gun. Because where you have a tune where you have the tune on which the mass is based in the free voice, especially if it's going to be a little different from the way the tune is usually presented, then that means that there is probably a statement of the tune happening in one of the missing voices at the same time. And here I'm going to show you the same page, but here with my fillings in. And you can see now that at this point, exactly the same point, we have the tenor now coming in just after the discantus, rather the altus, forgive me. So the altus first at the beginning of the bar, and then a fourth higher, the tenor comes in. So you see that this, the presence of the altus here was a strong clue that the tenor, in fact, was giving you a statement of the borrowed material. Here's another example, which is again what I like to call a smoking gun. At the very top, you'll see a very frightening thing for the reconstructor, which is that the two voices that happen to survive are doing nothing. So you know that you're going to have to come up with the material yourself. And because it's going to be counterpoint, the only thing you know is that your two missing voices are both going to be active at this point. But if we look at the bottom of the page, we see that the bass voice is all of a sudden starting to do this rather curious thing, an ostinato with dotted minims in this edition, which starts in the last system of the page. And you can see that it carries on in the next page, most of the next page, and then finishing at the final system, the last system of that page. Now, again, this is what I like to call a smoking gun. When a composer does this kind of ostinato, he's usually doing it against some other voice. And that other voice is usually going to be the borrowed tune. So here again, I show you my realization, and you can see that the at the point where the basses has started, or just after, we're going to fit the tenor here. In fact, if you go to the end, let me see if this is in the way. If you go to the, I'm trying to move this banner here. There we go. If we go to the end, we can see, oh, there's another banner. I'm not sure whether you're able to see the banner or whether it's just getting in my way. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay, right. Thank you. That's good. So, so what you can see is that there is a the Renaissance version of a cadence at the second bar of the last system. And that's telling us that that's going to be the end point for the tenor statement. And so all I have to do, as it were, is work my way back from there, fit in the tune, and there we go. So we have here another instance of the tenor voice and some kind of clue in the polyphony that's letting us know that we're going to be fitting in the tenor voice at this point. Okay, here is a final instance of a kind of detective work that you've had to do, that I've had to do. Now, in this case here, um, this is the beginning of a new section. And I started just on the assumption that, well, I started with the pitch B in the tenor in the first bar, and I switched the first pitch of the cantus firmus. And then I saw that in the second bar, there's a change of harmony, as we might say, anachronistically. But the second pitch, C, comes in very well here. And then the third pitch, D, in the third bar, and I said, okay, so here he's taken the pitches, the rhythms of the tune out, and he's taken just the he's taken the rhythms out and he's just left the pitches. So I said, okay, if I've got to D here, I need 4 statements. The tune begins bum, 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 bum. That D needs to be stated 4 times. So bar 3, D works here. Bar 4, it works here. Bar 5, it works here. And then bar 6, I can't fit a D at the beginning of bar 6 because we've got a C and a G in the extant voices. And this was very puzzling, obviously, because it was kind of strange that a planned statement or a planned use of the tune should work very well for 5 bars and then go wrong. Well, with a little bit of detective work, I ended up understanding what was going on. So here is my solution. Lois mentioned in introducing me that one of the things we've done is to discover the original notation of one of the Credo statements. This is an example here. So each of these pitches, you can see in this example, every pitch of the tune is retained, but is expressed as one of the same type of duration, which is to say a breve in the original notation. But then you can see that there are 3 breves which are white, and then 3 breves which are black or under coloration or colored, as we say, is the technical term. Now, what does a colored breve do? A breve under coloration or a colored breve is worth 2/3 of the value of an uncolored one. Now, why do they do this? Well, they do this so that they have a way of notating triplet rhythms. Basically, that's what coloration allows you to do. But the point is that if we have these these 3 breves as D, these 3 semi-breves as D, for the 4th, 5th, and 6th pitches, instead of being worth 3 bars, they're worth 2 bars. And so that allows me, therefore, going to the next page, you can see here on this slide how my problem that I was telling you about has disappeared. B, C, D, and then 3 colored Ds, and then a C, and this works fine. So the harmonic change now corresponds. And so what I discovered, going back to the notation, is that Obrecht has basically done this thing, which is typically Obrecht, is that he's expressed all the pitches in the same note value, but you can see that he's ordered them in groups of 3, colored, respectively colored and uncolored. And then what he's done is that in the same section, you can see, well, for this line of notation, there's a repeat sign at the very end that tells you that you have to start it again. You have to start singing this again. But what I discovered, fitting the pitches to the music, is that the second time you read it, you read the semi-breves that were void or white, you have to read them colored. And likewise, and rather conversely, the semi-breves, sorry, I keep calling them breves, the semi-breves that were colored the first time around, you read as uncolored. And if you do that, then your cantus firmus works fine for the second part of this section. Now, what Obrecht would have done is you could see at the top above the stave, I have a canon. A canon in our period doesn't just mean, it can mean the idea that we have of canon now, which is that one voice does exactly what the other voice was doing before and just follows it, as in Three Blind Mice. But a canon originally means a rubric or a law or an instruction. And so the canon very often is a verbal canon, as here, a canon made up of words, an instruction made up of words, which is telling you what you're supposed to be doing. Now, this is a sort of canon which we call an enigmatic canon. The best way to think of an enigmatic canon is to think of it in terms of a crossword, a cryptic crossword. In a normal crossword, we have a definition, and when we find the definition of the word, we can supply the missing word at that point of the crossword. If we have a cryptic crossword, usually our instruction about the word is going to be, our clue isn't going to be just a description or definition. It's going to be something cryptic. So in other words, it's going to be a puzzle which we have to work out in order to work out the clue. And very often that enigmatic or cryptic crossword is going to tell you actually that this is an anagram. So you have to take, you know that the letters here you're going to have to take and you're going to have to jumble them up and make an anagram. So it's a very exact analogy in the sense that the cryptic or enigmatic canon is going to tell the singer, remember that they're reading from the original notation, that it's going to tell the singer what you're expected to do, but it's going to do it in a way which involves a puzzle. Here, I found from the Bible, from Isaiah, a quotation which actually gives us an instruction that exactly mirrors what the singer is supposed to do. Qui ambulabat in tenebris videt lux. You might know this from the Messiah, the people that walked in darkness, or here, he who walked in darkness has seen light. And so what this rubric is telling you is that when you walked in darkness the last time around, the first time you performed the music, the next time around you see light. So in other words, what was dark becomes light and vice versa. And so this is the kind of detective work that one has to do sometimes in order to work out how Obrecht uses the borrowed material in the different sections of the Mass. interest of time, I'm just going to say a little bit more, give a few more examples as we go on. Okay, the problem of the top voice now, I think I've dealt with aspects of the tenor voice fairly, I've given a fairly clear indication of the sort of problems involved with reconstructing the tenor. Now I'm going to move on with just a couple of examples to look at free material, freely composed material, which particularly involves the discantus, the top voice. So here are the first few systems of the Gloria, the beginning of the Gloria. And what you can see is that it begins with the altus, and perhaps you can recognize the tune already. Ba, 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 ba. Okay, that looks very much like the Scaramella tune, of course. And then when it finishes at the end of the second system, the bass comes in and does exactly the same thing. Now, that again is a kind of smoking gun. The fact that the altus and the bassus both quote the tune, but sort of, remember the beginning, not ba 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 bum bum, but ba 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 bum 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 as they do it. Why that alteration? Why that little change? Well, because that's a signal that the discantus is, and then the tenor after it, are going to be giving you exactly the same material in close imitation with the altus and the bassus. And this is what we get. So you see that I've fitted exactly the same material, but now, well, except with the Scaramella tune, except without that little modification. Ba 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 bum ba ba bum 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 bum. So you can hear that the rhythms have been modified a bit, but the basic shape and actually most of the rhythms of the tune are exactly right there. And then the tenor comes in. And does the same, as you can see from the rest of it here. So these are, again, an example of the sorts of clues that you can get from the existing polyphony and that help you to fit in whatever what the missing voices are doing. If we look at this page here, you can also see in the third system, the bass is going to come in and it's going to give us the tune yet again in different values. In the third system, the last bar. Ba 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 bum ba 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 bum. And you can see that it's possible to fit exactly the same thing up at the perfect fourth in the tenor. And so you can see that where the bass leaves off, the tenor comes in. That middle bar of the last system, the tenor has taken over from the bassus. And then the bassus is going to do the same thing and start again with the next bit of the tune when the tenor falls silent. So here again is another instance of the activity of the existing voices, the voices that survive, telling us what's going on with the voices that are missing. There would be quite a few other examples that I could give you. One that very quickly here, this is the beginning of the Qui Tollis, the second part of the Gloria. And you can see in the, just before the bass finishes in the second line, the second system, I should say, you have this, actually, if you take it from the altus, the beginning of that system, that's bar 60, we can see in the altus, we have ba ba da ba da ba da ba da ba dum ba ba bum bum bum. And in fact, it's going to be possible for me to take that idea and to fit it in several times. So for example, at bar 64, or 63, when the discantus comes in the second system, it's going to take exactly that same idea, but transposed. And then when the tenor comes in, a bit later, if you look at its material at bar 69, same thing again. So Obrecht, it turns out, is actually very fond of doing this thing whereby you take a short motive or cell and you distribute it and you play it around and pass it around between the free voices. And this is something that he does so often that the fact that we can do it here is a kind of circular thing. It's the idea, the process of Obrecht generates the possibility that we could fit it in here, and the fact that we can fit it in here is also a validation of the process. So there's a kind of virtuous circle of confirmation going on here. Okay, I had a few more examples, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to leave it there. Here, by the way, just in passing, at the top of this page in the first system, you could see that very scary part that I mentioned earlier, that those first two systems consist, for the most part, of material where the extant voices are missing, or rather are missing, or rather are silent. So I've had to supply all the polyphony myself. Although this happens actually relatively rarely in this mass, as it turns out. Okay, well, let's have a few conclusions about the sorts of things I've learned in the process of reconstructing. Well, one is to keep things simple. Another is not to be afraid of silence. Very often, if the voices that we have make contrapuntal sense all by themselves, then it may well be that we don't need to add anything else. What I've shown you most of all is the importance of spotting the clues. This brings me to a good old French expression, tout est bon dans le cochon, with apologies to vegetarians and vegans, to say that the idea of this is that, you know, when you killed a pig, you could basically, you used absolutely everything. Everything in the pig could be put to good use. And in a similar way, you can really, by reading the material that survives from the voices that we happen to have, by reading them as closely as possible, there are very few situations that you're not going to be able to solve just by using, reusing, deducing, reading intelligently the material that you have. Finally, and maybe most speculatively, it's important to recognize a conceptual gap, if you will, between what we know the composer has done via 30 masses that survive, but also acknowledge that there is a gap between what the composer has done and what the composer might have done. So the Credo canon that I showed you is a good example, because actually we don't have any other example in Obrecht's music of a canon that works like the one I've shown you. And so very often when reconstructing, we can be shy of coming up with a solution because we say, well, I don't know this from this composer's work anywhere else. And so we might be a bit hesitant. The fact that this canon fits the notes exactly and that there's no other way of notating it in the original notation suggests, on the other hand, that this is the correct solution. And so the fact that it happens to be new in terms of Obrecht is not something that should deter us. We need to accept that it might be something that the composer, is this something rather that the composer might have done? And certainly it is something that feels a very Obrechtian way of dealing with the material, even though we've had no precise analogy in his composed work. So that's a very important distinction to bear in mind. Right, very briefly then, we're planning a recording. We're planning performances in 2024, next year. We're planning an edition of the Reconstruction, and I'm going to say a bit more and dwell a bit more detail about the reconstruction process in a number of articles that are going to appear, which will allow things to be laid out. I understand that the BBC Early Music Program is already interested in covering this project a bit nearer the time when the edition and recordings come out. So there are good practical outcomes from this. Most of all, though, and most excitingly, we have a new mass by one of the great composers of the Renaissance. And so that's perhaps the thing that I'm happiest of all about. Thank you very much for your attention. And if there are any questions, I'd be very glad to try and tackle them. Thank you.
Thanks, Fabrice. I'm going to have a look in a minute at the Q&A box. So if you do have a question, anyone that's watching and listening, if you could put it in there, that would be great. In the meantime, and seeing that there are not yet any questions, I think I'll ask you a couple, Fabrice, about a couple of specific areas. Just to go to what you were just finishing on there, talking about the difference between what the composer's done and what the composer might have done. It struck me, I suppose, with my own particular perspectives and interests, that you know, how does this kind of reconstruction in musical terms, how is it different from, say, visual reconstructions of paintings that we also see from this period? Some, as we've seen in recent press articles, that go very wrong, and others that are done very meticulously by a lot of research into paints and pigments and so on. It strikes me that what's really interesting here is that there must be places, just from just by process of elimination, I suppose, there must be places where you absolutely have got the material as it originally would have been. And so to that extent, I think, you know, are we listening to an original work by a composer from the 15th century? Are we listening to Fabrice Fitch? How do you think about that? If you want to stop sharing your screen, by the way, I think then you can be seen in a bigger square.
Okay. Yes, sure. Well, I think actually that the analogy with the visual element is a very good one, because, you know, you're talking about color, there's all sorts of things. You know, one example is that if you've got that nativity of Piero that does seem to have been botched by the restorers, that's just a technical thing. Those shepherds look terrible. The faces of the shepherds is just really bad painting. So there the analogy would be simply, if I didn't know what I was doing in terms of writing counterpoint in the 15th century style, I suppose. The question of, I mean, if you look at the Piero Nativity, for example, let's say that we had a nativity with a big hole in it, but that there were no shepherds. If those shepherds were entirely missing, then we could deduce that at that point in the painting, it must be shepherds that we're dealing with. And in a similar way, I would say that, you know, if you've got a place where all of a sudden all the voices, the voices that we have come in, then we can say, well, if it's the tenor that's missing, then that's very likely a place where the tenor is going to come in with the cantus firmus. So to get back to the aspect of your question that deals with the level of certainty, the bits that I showed you in this presentation are the things where basically I can bet my house. Our house. Yes, I bet our house. Yes, well, I would actually for those bits, maybe not down to the last note, but certainly that is the general process, that is what is going on. So are we listening to a new mass by Obrecht? Well, not exactly, of course, but we're listening to, I guess you can say that we're listening to something that comes as close to what we are able to tell as possible. One of the ways, very briefly on this, another thing to say is that Philip and I basically came to formulated the idea that we wanted to do something. You cannot reproduce the original by definition, and that's clear. So what you're aiming for is really to produce a version, produce something, offer a solution that the composer would have recognized. Yeah. Why is that? Why is that important? It's simply because Obrecht, like all these people, these singers, they improvised counterpoint every day. I won't get into how they did this, but believe me, they did. And they did it in front of plain song. They had the plain song book in front of them, and they sang and improvised lines from the plain chant using that as basis. They did this every day. So we can bet that every day they would do something a bit different. And so similarly, Obrecht, confronted with exactly the same written material on another day, would have done something a bit different, very likely. And so as long as it was something that he could have looked at and said, yeah, that's not actually how I did it, but yeah, I could do that. That makes sense. Then that's good enough for us.
Excellent. And that sort of takes me actually to the next thing I was going to talk about with you a little bit, which, and I do see that there is one question that we must come to. But obviously, I mean, I think most people listening will have been fascinated by, in particular, the enigmatic canon and how that plays out in the notation. And there you were just talking about the performer's capacity to improvise from plain chant, and we know the complexities of duration, and it's perhaps worth explaining very briefly that duration is contextually determined in this period, and as is pitch. So there's not absolute values, such as if you're reading a part in a score today, your values are given to you, and so on, whereas pitch and rhythm are contextually duration are contextually determined. So to be able to improvise polyphony is really shows an incredible facility with that material as a performer. But this is really performer's music. I think quite often music from this period gets kind of classed as all that sort of old church music. And actually, I think one really important thing that this work brings out is that it's a performer's music, and it's music that should be performed, because actually what's written on the page doesn't tell the whole story. From what you were describing about those canons, that didn't turn into a question, but maybe you'd like to just reflect on that for a minute.
Well, what's written on the page doesn't tell the whole story, and what you hear doesn't tell the whole story. It's really the work. I mean, it raises the question of where the musical work is situated. Some people might say, is the idea of musical work pertinent for this period? And I would very strongly argue that it is. It doesn't come weighted with the baggage that it does in the 19th century, certainly. But no, these people understood what a musical work was, of the specificity of the individual work. But as regards the status of the notation and of the musical sound, we could say that there are, in a piece like this, or in a situation like the Credo canon, the work really, where is the work? Well, the work is both in the notation and in the sound. It's both consubstantially, if I can put it, for use a theological metaphor, that it is both at once. It is both at once.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm going to go to a couple of questions from people who are watching. First of all, from Hattie Beckett, thank you for your question. She says, you showed some fascinating examples of how you went about reconstructing, which seemed logical and convincing. Were there any bits where you felt uncomfortable about your reconstruction?
Not uncomfortable, but certainly aware that it was more speculative, or necessarily speculative. I'd be happy to share that in more detail, but it would start getting complicated. But there is certainly one place where what we did is a possible solution. I mean, I'm pretty sure, but I wouldn't bet our house on that one. But I'm quite confident that what we did for that particular place was something that is possibly what the composer did. I'm certainly sure that even if it wasn't what he did do, that given the available information, it works very well, and it embodies a certain level of technical challenge, which the context at that point, for all that the part is missing, which the context plainly implies. Let's put it that way. So a lot of the time, I mean, I would say that about 60% of the time, let's put a stupid figure on it, I'd bet our house, that the process is right, even if the details might be wrong. And about, the remaining 40% is one of those things where I'm pretty sure Obrecht would have said, yeah, that works. No, I didn't actually do that, but that works. I hope that's a coherent enough answer. If you want more details, I'd be delighted to share them.
Thank you. And we've got a couple of questions from Gordon Monroe. Do we know anything else about the Missa Scaramella, the location of composition, the approximate date, for example, and has any other evidence from the manuscript beyond the actual notes been of value in the reconstruction?
Well, I've not been able to go to Krakow for various practical and political reasons, but I am going to go in the next month because I've got to, I've got to say I've looked at the source and so on. It's actually a very good source. I won't say too much about when it was written, but I'm pretty sure that this is a late-ish work. I can't be absolutely certain, but it's a comparatively late source. It was compiled probably within a decade of Obrecht's death, which is already quite interesting because Obrecht's music stops being copied very soon after he dies. And that's an indication, perhaps. Might it have been composed when he was working at Ferrara in the court of Ercole d'Este in 1503, 1504? Yes, because the Scaramella tune is well known, but it doesn't actually survive, as far as I know, outside of Italy or by Italian composers who were working in Italy at the time. So I would say that an Italian destination is quite plausible, and the fact that he was in Italy and actually dies in Ferrara does make me think it could very well be a late work.
Okay, that would be really late based on the
yes, it would.
Yeah,
I think that is consistent with what a lot of what I observe about the way that the Mass is put together, and some of the things that he does with the material.
Excellent. Thank you very much to you. I'm just going to do one last check. Yeah, there's no more questions that I can see. So thank you again, Fabrice, and Ben has very helpfully put some links to your recent work and so on in the chat. So anyone that's interested in reading more about this, or obviously Fabrice can be contacted at RCS as well.
So look out for that recording on Hyperion in 2024, all being well.
Also that. And Ben has also put in the chat information about next week's, not next week, what am I talking about? Monday, the 20th of February, 6 till 7 p.m. in-person talk in the Fife Lecture Theatre on instruments of change with Sandy Coffin, who's one of our PhD students. But again, thank you very much, Fabrice. Thank you for betting our house multiple times. But I have to say, after 25 years, I do have faith in your work. Yes, I can also attest to the, I mean, it's a fantastic enterprise, this, and it draws on both your compositional and your musicological know-how, but it's been fascinating to watch your process and watch the times when the solution has presented itself and the times when it hasn't, and to sort of navigate that frustration alongside you has been my immense privilege. So thank you very much. And yeah, good luck with the rest of it. And thank you to everybody who's been listening and watching, and to Ben for steering us through.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks, Lois. And thanks everyone for your attention.
Good night, everyone. Thank you again. Bye-bye.